Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Project Octane. I think I should start off by saying a big thank you to everyone new to the channel. There's over 500 of you, mostly in thanks to the video that Fluump and I worked on as of this morning that had roughly 23,000 views. So that's a lot. There's also several $100s worth of small donations that came in. So that's exactly what we're looking for, and we greatly appreciate it from everyone out there. So thank you very much and welcome. Now I guess to get on with the part that most of y'all are here for. So everything up to this point really has all been design focused, and that's going to actually include today's episode as well. However, I'm glad to announce that starting next week, I'm going to be traveling up to meet with one of our team members who's going to be welding the frame together for us, and we're actually going to start building the chassis that we've been showing off in previous videos. So big weekend ahead of us here in order to get ready for next week, but that'll be in the works, so you aren't going to see a video from me next week. Hopefully we'll have some content the following week for what we are able to accomplish. Over the next month and a half is really when we're going to be putting most of this together, and everything that you've seen so far and all these different renders hopefully come together as one assembly. So I'm really excited for that. I hope y'all are too, but for today we are going to stick with the design side of things for one more episode for now, and we're going to be looking at some of the little things that go along with this project. So we're going to start by looking at our lower control arm and how it's mounted to the chassis. You can see that it's just kind of sandwiched between these two square tubes. And one of the things that we want to be able to do with the lower control arms was provide some camber adjustment, so that way when we weld up this whole frame and assemble everything, that we have a little bit of flexibility, that the numbers that we got from reverse engineering everything we know aren't going to be perfect. Hopefully they're close enough, and that by giving ourselves a little bit of adjustment, we can get everything kind of spot on from there. So that's why we've got these kind of weird slots in the frame here. That's for the camber kit that we bought associated with these SUVs. Now, because the bracket is as tall as it is, it won't actually fit inside of that tube. And so to prevent any potential tube wall crushing issue, since it is thin wall tubing, we do have a spacer that we've designed as well that fits inside of the tube. On the other side, the bolt actually can fit up against the inner face of the other square tube. And so we don't need any sort of crush protection on that end. But if you take away the chassis and you take away the lower control arm for just a minute and just look at the bolted connection, you can see you've got the bracket and the eccentric nut that make up the camber adjustment, the crush support, the bolt that'll go through the lower control arm, and then this small aluminum spacer just gives a little bit more pressure distribution on the other tube. Moving on to the upper control arms, one of the big things that we talked about in the chassis video was actually building the Octane in sections lengthwise down the vehicle. And while that certainly helps us out, it does create a couple issues here and there. For one, the suspension geometry drives a certain configuration and placement of the upper control arm because we started by positioning the lower. This is sort of just along for the ride. And as a result, you don't end up with something that cleanly mates up against the face of a tube like it did on the bottom. Also, in the case of using bent tubing, we can't just butt a flat face of the upper control arm up against the tangent round edge of the tube. So with that in mind, we went ahead and had these sort of weld bushings manufactured. These just provide a clearance hole for the bolt on the ID and mate and weld up with the tubing on the outer diameter. And we actually have a jig plate that we're going to be showing off in the build videos that helps us position all of these things. For the rear, it's a similar story. Slightly larger offsets between the section lines and the face of the upper control arms, but we just use a slightly longer bushing, and that solves our problem. Now, we talked a lot about the shocks last episode. Just to briefly recap, we were talking about having some threaded inserts and a welded tube that go across, and I'm happy to say that we have the welded inserts here. While it's a little difficult to tell in the model, you can see that the larger diameter of this and the outer face is what's butting up against the inside of the upper control arms, and then the tube runs across and through the shock, where it'll eventually be welded and cut and finished. In terms of mounting the suspension, we're nearly there. The only thing left really is controlling the steering angle of the wheel. Obviously a steering rack in the front. In the rear we have to use a couple rods to fix these in place. So we have the stock outer tie rod ends that's associated with these vehicles. Unfortunately, due to the differences between the SUV and the Octane dimensionally, we did have to come in and make these custom inner tie rods, as well as use some COTS ball joints to mount it back to the frame, but nothing crazy. These are just threaded rod. It's just 2 different threads on either end of it, give us a little bit more adjustment there, and then a spherical joint allow the suspension to articulate. On the fronts, once again, we get to use the OEM outer tie rod end, a custom threaded rod in between, and then inside we have our steering rack. We purchased this guy from a company that deals a lot with buggies and sand rails. This thing's rated to 2,200 pounds, so that should be more than what our expected weight of the Octane is by a slim margin. Having the center mount with the pinion also was a big driving factor with this. All of your OEM steering racks in any commuter car, SUV, vehicle, you name it really, anything you see on the road, the pinion for the steering rack is offset to one side towards the driver's side and angled slightly, mostly to get around the engine in most of those vehicles. In our case, because the engine's in the rear and it's a single seater, having that major offset was going to create a lot of issues. So having the center mount here solves a lot of problems, and it's pretty simple to use. But as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of small parts hidden throughout this build. Now, obviously, a lot of this hardware and whatnot out is all the larger stuff. I actually have a couple boxes of quarter 20s and smaller nuts, bolts, washers. I'm sure there's a couple hundred piece parts sitting back there that are going to also be used in various places. Just not something worth spilling out all over this table. But hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of some of the stuff that's already been in work and some of the stuff that we've already put time and money into that are going to pay off in the long run. And like I said, hopefully next week we'll really start putting a lot of this stuff together and just be on the lookout for more to come. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.